Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a heartbreaking story. What would you do if the woman you love and your newborn child were both fighting for their lives in the same night, and you had no idea who you might lose first? Stay with me to find out what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The night didn't begin with panic. It began quietly. Too quietly. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is about to happen, but you don't know when or how bad it will be. The wind moved slowly through the derevnya, brushing against the wooden walls of the small house. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, pressing low as if the air itself had thickened. Inside, Tieu Lac sat on the edge of the bed, one hand gripping the blanket, the other pressed tightly against her belly. Her breathing had changed, shorter, uneven. Not pain, not yet. But something was building. The CEO noticed immediately. He had been watching her more closely these past few days. Every movement, every pause, every breath that seemed even slightly different. "What is it?" he asked, moving toward her quickly. She shook her head. "I don't know." Her voice was strained, but it feels wrong. That word, wrong. It didn't sound like much, but in that moment, it meant everything. He crouched in front of her, his eyes searching hers. "Is it the same as before?" She hesitated, then slowly, "No." A pause. "This is worse." The room went still. Every sound seemed to disappear, even the wind outside. "Since when?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Since earlier." She tried to take a deeper breath, but it caught halfway. "And you didn't tell me. I thought it would pass." But it didn't, and now it was getting stronger. The first wave of pain came suddenly. Sharp, deep, enough to make her body tense instantly. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Her breath broke. "Tieu Lac, I'm okay." But she wasn't. The second wave came faster, stronger, and this time, she couldn't hide it. Her body bent slightly forward, one hand gripping his arm as if it was the only thing holding her in place. "Hey, look at me." His voice was steady, but his hands, they weren't. "What's happening?" She shook her head again, panic creeping into her eyes now. "I don't know." Her other hand pressed harder against her belly. "It hurts." The word barely left her lips before another wave hit, and this time she cried out, not loud, but enough. Enough to break something inside him. He stood up immediately. "We're going to the hospital." "No, wait." But she couldn't finish. Her breathing was already too unstable. The pain, coming faster now, closer, too close. The road was dark, empty. The headlights cut through the night as the car sped forward, tires scraping against uneven ground. He drove faster than he ever had before, but it didn't feel fast enough, not when every second felt like it was slipping through his hands. "Tieu Lac, stay with me." She leaned back against the seat, her face pale, her lips trembling. "I'm here." But her voice, it sounded distant, faint. Another contraction hit, stronger than the last. Her entire body tensed, her hand gripping the edge of the seat as if she could hold herself together by force alone. "It's too soon," she whispered. The words hit him like a blow. Too soon. The baby wasn't ready. Not yet. Not like this. "Just hold on," he said, his voice tightening. "We're almost there." But the truth was, they weren't. The nearest hospital was still too far for what was happening now. The car hit a sudden bump, hard. Tieu Lac gasped sharply, her hand flying to her belly. "Stop." He froze. "What?" "Stop the car." Her voice broke. "I can't." Another wave of pain cut her off, and this time, it didn't pass. It stayed, heavy, relentless. Her breathing became uneven, almost panicked now. "I can't hold it." The words came out in fragments. I can't. He looked ahead, then back at her, then ahead again. There was nothing around them, no lights, no houses, no help, just an empty road and a night that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too unforgiving. He made the decision in a second, pulled the car to the side, the engine cut, and the silence that followed was terrifying. Tieu Lac, listen to me. He moved to her side immediately, his hands shaking now, no longer able to hide it. Look at me. She tried, but her vision blurred. Her body felt like it was splitting under the pressure, pain coming in waves that gave her no time to breathe. It's too early, she whispered again. Tears slipped from the corner of her eyes. I'm scared. He swallowed hard. So was he, more than he had ever been, but he couldn't show it. Not now, not when she needed something to hold on to. I'm here, he said firmly. You're not alone. Another contraction, stronger. Her grip on his hand tightened painfully. I can't do this. Yes, you can. His voice didn't shake this time. You have to. She shook her head weakly. I don't know how. And that was the truth, because nothing about this was supposed to happen like this. Not here, not now, not without help. Not without a doctor, not without anything. The wind outside picked up, the car rocked slightly, and inside, everything changed. A sharp cry tore through the silence, different this time. Not just pain, something deeper, something final. His heart dropped. Tieu Lac, what's happening? She couldn't answer. Her body had already begun. There was no stopping it now, no turning back. The baby was coming, right here, right now, in the middle of nowhere, in a car that wasn't prepared, in a night that felt like it was closing in around them. His hands froze for just a second. Then he moved. Instinct, fear, love, everything at once. Stay with me. He repeated it again, like a promise, like a plea. I'm right here. Her hand searched for his blindly, found it, held on, as if letting go meant losing everything. Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Seconds stretched into something unbearable. Her breathing, his voice, the sound of the wind. Everything blurred together until a sound, small, weak, but real. He froze, looked down, and for a moment, the world stopped. The baby had been born, too small, too quiet, too fragile. His hands trembled as he lifted the tiny body carefully. Hey, hey, his voice broke. Breathe. No response, just a faint movement, almost nothing. Behind him, Tieu Lac's breathing had slowed. Too much. Tieu Lac? No answer. His heart slammed against his chest. Tieu Lac, stay with me. Nothing. Her head tilted slightly to the side, her eyes half closed. Too still, too quiet, too wrong. And in that moment, everything he had feared became real. Two lives, both slipping, both fragile, and him, standing in the middle of it, with nothing but his hands and a choice he didn't know how to make. Which one to save first? For a moment, he couldn't move. Not because he didn't want to, but because his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. The baby in his hands, too small, too still, barely breathing. And behind him, Tieu Lac, silent, fading. The night pressed in around them, suffocating, as if the world itself had stepped back and left him alone with an impossible choice. Tieu Lac. His voice broke, no response. He turned back to the child, his hands trembling uncontrollably now. Come on, breathe. Nothing, only a faint, fragile twitch. He had never felt so powerless. All the control he once had, the power, the decisions, the certainty. None of it mattered here, none of it could save them. But instinct didn't wait for answers. It moved. He placed the baby carefully against his chest, using his body warmth, remembering something, anything he had once heard, something about premature babies, about warmth, about breath. Stay with me. He didn't even know who he was speaking to anymore, the child or himself. Then he turned back to Tieu Lac. His hand touched her face. Cold. Too cold. Tieu Lac, open your eyes. Nothing. His heart pounded harder, louder, faster. No, no, no. Don't do this. For the first time, fear truly broke through him. Not the quiet fear he had been carrying, but raw, uncontrolled, desperate. He shook her gently. Tieu Lac. Her head moved slightly, barely. A faint sound escaped her lips, not a word, just breath. But it was enough to pull him back. Stay with me, he whispered urgently. Don't leave, not now, not like this. Her fingers twitched weakly against the seat. And in that moment, he knew. He didn't have the luxury to choose. He had to save both or lose everything. He moved fast, faster than he ever had, one hand holding the baby close to his chest, keeping it warm, protecting every fragile movement. The other supporting Tieu Lac, adjusting her position, trying to keep her breathing steady. You hear me? His voice was low but firm. You're not allowed to give up. Her lips parted slightly. Cold. The word barely formed, but he heard it. Immediately, he pulled off his jacket, wrapping it around both of them, Tieu Lac and the baby, his movements urgent, careful, precise in a way he didn't know he was capable of. I've got you. The words came out without thinking. I've got both of you. Then he made the decision. There was no more waiting, no more hesitation. He started the car again. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence of the night. And this time, he didn't slow down. The road blurred beneath them. Every second stretched painfully. Every breath felt like it carried weight. Tieu Lac drifted in and out of consciousness, her head leaning against the seat, her breathing shallow. The baby, still too quiet, too weak. Every now and then, he would glance down quickly, checking, hoping, praying for any sign. Stay with me, he whispered again, over and over, as if repeating it could anchor them to this world. When the hospital lights finally appeared in the distance, he didn't feel relief. Not yet. Not until they were inside. Not until someone else could take over. Not until he knew they were safe. The car stopped abruptly. The doors opened. Voices, footsteps, hands reaching. What happened? Premature birth, no equipment. She's losing consciousness. His words came out fast, broken, barely controlled. They took the baby first, then Tieu Lac, both disappearing through separate doors. And just like that, he was left standing alone. Again. But this time, there was nothing he could do. The waiting was worse than anything before. Minutes passed, or hours. He couldn't tell. The hallway was too quiet, too still, too indifferent to what was happening inside those rooms. He sat, stood, walked, then sat again, his hands still trembling, his chest tight, every second filled with one question. Did he do enough? The door opened. A doctor stepped out. His heart stopped. How is she? The doctor looked at him carefully. We managed to stabilize her. His knees almost gave out. But that word, again. The doctor continued. She lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours are critical. He nodded slowly, barely hearing. And the baby? A pause long enough to hurt. Premature, very weak. We've moved the baby to intensive care. Silence, not relief, not yet. Just uncertainty. Will the baby survive? The doctor didn't answer immediately. We're doing everything we can, which meant nothing was certain. Later that night, he stood outside the glass window, looking in. The baby lay inside a small incubator, tiny, fragile, connected to machines that breathed softly in the quiet room. For a moment, he couldn't recognize it. That small life, so vulnerable, so close to slipping away. "I'm here." His voice was barely audible. "I didn't leave you." His hand pressed lightly against the glass. "And I won't." Then he turned, walked slowly down the hallway, stopped at another door, Tieu Lac's room. He opened it quietly. She lay there, pale, still, but breathing. Alive, he stepped closer, sat beside her, and for the first time since everything happened, he allowed himself to breathe. Just a little. His hand found hers, gently, carefully. "You scared me." His voice was soft, raw. "I thought I lost you." Her fingers moved slightly, almost unnoticeable, but real. And then, slowly, her eyes opened, weak, blurry, but aware. "The baby?" The first thing she asked. He closed his eyes briefly, then looked at her again. "He's fighting." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "Like you?" He nodded. "Like us." Silence settled between them, not heavy this time, not suffocating, just fragile, like everything else. But alive, still alive. And for now, that was enough. In a quiet countryside night, Tieu Lac suddenly goes into premature labor with no medical support, forcing the CEO to face a terrifying situation alone. As the pain intensifies, she gives birth in the car, but both she and the baby fall into critical condition. The newborn is weak and barely breathing, while Tieu Lac loses consciousness after severe exhaustion and blood loss. Desperate and overwhelmed, the CEO struggles to keep them alive until he can reach the hospital. Once there, both are rushed into emergency care, leaving him waiting in fear and uncertainty. Doctors manage to stabilize Tieu Lac, but the baby remains in intensive care, fighting for survival. Standing between relief and despair, the CEO realizes that despite everything he sacrificed, the greatest battle has only just begun. For the two lives he loves most,